so that first section kind of set things up, right? Because it's just sort of emphasizing the point that the Quran uses either a completely new or an uncommon name for Jesus. And so then we might ask the question, is Jesus of the Quran a fundamentally different character? I mean, there's a lot that's different with the Quranic Jesus. A lot. And I mean, sometimes with my students, I make the point that, like, just because two people have the same name, and actually in this case, they don't have the same name, but even if they did, I mean, in English, we say Jesus and Jesus. I know some Muslims like to say Isa, even in English. But I mean, let's just say everyone's saying Jesus. I mean, even if you have the same name, doesn't mean you're the same, right? Like, I don't know, there's Michael Jordan and lots of other folks named Michael. Michael Jackson. One is a singer, one is a basketball player. I mean, they're pretty different. So in the same way, we can ask a question, if we kind of look at the bio of the Jesus of the Quran and the Jesus of the Gospels, how much do they actually have in common? Potentially, does the Quran use either a new or a minority name with Jesus just to make that point that its take on Jesus is so different? By the way, this movie poster over here is from an Iranian movie that I show my students sometimes by a director known as Nader Talebzadeh. I don't know, it was done like early 2000s. Someone maybe in the comments will get the year and maybe knows a little bit about it. But one of the cool things about the movie that kind of corresponds with my talk is that there are two endings. So it's one of those movies, there's been a couple of those through the years, one of those movies with two endings. In one ending, there's got a little screen with words which says, the end of Jesus' life according to the Christian Gospels, and you see Jesus crucified. And then it turns to another ending, again, a blank screen with some words that come up, and they say, the ending of Jesus' life according to the Gospel of Barnabas and reliable Islamic sources. And there you see Jesus doesn't die, but Judas takes the shape of Jesus, and Judas dies, and Jesus goes right up to heaven. So interesting movie. Anyway, it's not the time to speak too much about the movie. Okay, so I'll do these slides pretty quickly. This just to remind you, there are common bits in the Christian Gospels and the Quran about Jesus, his virgin birth. He heals people, he raises the dead, but in the Quran it's by the permission of God. He's associated with the Holy Spirit, both in the Gospels and the Quran. He's opposed by the Israelites. He lightens the law of Moses. So, you see this in Quran 3, where he says, I will make some of that which was forbidden to you permitted. He ascends to heaven, whether or not he dies. Quran 4:159, has that line, Rafa'ahu ilayhi, God raised Jesus up to himself. And, definitely in the Gospels and in the book of Revelation, Jesus returns in the end times. In the Bible and in the Quran, there might be a hint, where Jesus maybe is called a sign for the hour being, like the hour of resurrection, divine judgment. So there might be a hint that Jesus returns in the end times. Actually, in later Islamic tradition, it's basically a consensus that Jesus will return in the end times in their various hadith, which describe what he will do when he returns. Okay, so that's what's common. That's pretty significant. There's some things that are in the Quran that are not in the Gospels. The things that he says in the Quran are not the things he says in the Bible, right? So that none of his statements in the Quran, there's not a lot. Most of his statements are sort of polemics against the Jews of his time or against his own followers. And they just, for example, Quran chapter 5, verses 72, 73, or 116 to 118, they're not in the Gospels, right? They're just different. There are various miracles, which I won't go into depth now, which are not in the Gospels, but are in the Quran. Most of these are connected with later so-called apocryphal Gospels. The emphasis of Jesus as a magician, which does appear in Jewish anti-Christian writings. This is mentioned in the Quran. And then, of course, very important is the prediction of a messenger who will come after him in the Quran, who will be named Ahmad. which is obviously not in the Gospels. And then really interesting point that I'll return to is that Jesus seems to be associated with militancy in these two verses, Quran 61 and Surah At-Tawbah, Quran 9. And his helpers seem to be part in Quran 61:14 of this sort of militancy. It's kind of ambiguous, but that is in the Quran, not in the Gospels, okay? And then finally, and maybe his escape from the crucifixion, which I don't know, maybe that's stuff for another video. Okay, so but how about what's in the Gospels but not in the Quran about Jesus? I mean, almost everything. Gospels are pretty long texts. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I mean, they're all about Jesus. There's tons of stuff about Jesus. Very little of that is actually in the Quran. So just as none of the few statements in the Quran that Jesus speaks are found in the Gospels, none of the statements, which are extensive, not few, extensive, lessons about God, parables, discourses about his own identity, his divine mission, his relationship with both his opponents and with his friends, his disciples, lessons about God. None of that, Beatitudes, etc., none of that is in the Quran. So by the way, some of that will enter into later Islamic tradition in various sayings in works like Ihya al-Ulumuddin of Ghazali and works like that. So I'm going to get back to this image. I want to speak about that in a second. But I mean, I'll just open up all the bullet points here. No, go back. So, I mean, parables, all of the parables, all of them, prodigal son, lost sheep, parable of the sower, they're not in the Quran. The Beatitudes, loving your enemies, turning your cheek, removing the log from your eye instead of the speck of dust from your neighbor's eye. Defilement coming from the bad things on the inside of one and not from the food that one eats. Not in the Quran. The infancy narratives, the visitation of Mary and Elizabeth and Mary's proclamation of the Magnificat when she's pregnant with Jesus, bringing the baby Jesus into the temple where Simeon and Anna, various proclamations, or the young boy Jesus speaking about his father's house in the temple. All the narratives in Galilee, all of them, synagogue, nature miracles, everything that happens in Jordan River, including the baptism by John the Baptist, the meeting with the woman at the well in Samaria, everything that happens in Jerusalem, the transfiguration, where God affirms that this is my beloved son, all sorts of miracle accounts, the miracle at Cana, walking on water, the multiplication of loaves and fish, all of these things are not in the Quran. I said I mentioned this briefly. So this is a part of a work of art by an American artist who did this after 9/11 and wanted to show Muslims ways of connecting their faith to America and Americans to begin to think of Islam as, an American religion, not a foreign religion. He wrote out by hand a translation of the Quran and then illustrated it or illumined it with scenes of American life. So this is Quran 19, Surat Maryam or Mary. And so you see this market here with Our Lady of Guadalupe. So pretty cool. Okay, just more that you do not find in the Quran that you do find in the Gospels. I don't want to go on ad nauseum, but all of the characters are on Jesus. The Quran just refers sort of ambiguously or vaguely to Hawariyun, and the Gospels go into great detail. I mean, watch the series The Chosen, and you'll get to know some of them. Peter, all the disciples, Lazarus, Mary, Martha, Mary Magdalene, Zacchaeus, Herod, Pilate, Caiaphas, all these characters are missing. Interestingly, like in the Gospels, one of the main themes is Jesus's discourse in tension with the Jews around the Sabbath, Jewish law generally, but especially the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. Jesus speaks of himself as Lord of the Sabbath. All of this kind of question of the Jewishness of his day is sort of missing. This is why you sometimes hear this idea that, the Quran has a more Jewish Jesus. The Judaism of the Gospels, like that whole fabric, which is interwoven almost in every passage of the Gospels, is missing in the Quran. It's just not there. Questions about, Jesus and Jewish law, except for Quran 3, that one statement that he's lightening the law, all the questions of the Sabbath and kosher rules, and the temple, the practices, the various Jewish feasts, and fasts, They're just missing from the Quran. Okay, also missing Holy Week, obviously in the Passion narratives, triumphal entry, so-called Palm Sunday, cleansing the table, Last Supper or institution of the Eucharist, agony in the garden, etc., etc., etc. And needless to say, all the things that happen around the crucifixion and then the resurrection and the ascension on the Mount of Olives, the road to Emmaus scene in the Gospel of Luke, Gospel of at the end of the Gospel of John, where Thomas, touches the wounds of Christ, says, "My Lord and my God," obviously for theological reasons, is not in the Quran.